The city of New York glittered like a jewel box beneath the October night sky, its towers standing proud, their glass facades reflecting constellations of light. From the street, the metropolis looked infinite, but 70 floors above, in a private sanctuary carved out of steel and privilege, the world felt smaller, quieter, and infinitely colder. The Concord, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, sat like a crown atop a luxury skyscraper overlooking Central Park. It was not just a place to eat. It was a theater of power. Every polished mahogany panel, every velvet drape, every candlelit table was designed not merely for elegance, but to remind its guests that they belonged to the highest echelon of society. Dining here was not about food. It was about being seen, about looking down on the city, both literally and figuratively. The air itself was curated. Subtle notes of lemon oil, aged leather, and truffle butter drifted through the room like whispered secrets. Classical strings played softly from hidden speakers, weaving through the low hum of conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter that sounded more like performance than joy. Waiters moved with choreographed precision, their black uniforms and white gloves giving them the anonymity of stagehands. To the wealthy patrons, they were not people, they were function. Among these shadows moved Clara Monroe. At 26, she was the kind of presence meant to disappear. Her dark hair was pulled back into a strict knot, her uniform starched to perfection, her every movement graceful yet restrained. She refilled glasses before they were half empty, cleared plates before her guests realized they were finished, and smiled with a professional detachment that revealed nothing. She was by all appearances the perfect waitress. But beneath the surface of composure, a storm brewed. Clara had not been born to serve. She had been born into a life where she was served. The daughter of Jonathan Monroe, once one of America's most revered art historians. Her childhood had been filled with museum galas in Washington, D.C., summer retreats to Martha's Vineyard, and the kind of education designed to mold her into a woman of influence. She grew up with languages rolling off her tongue like second nature, with the vocabulary of art and history, as familiar as the lines of a lullaby. Yet here she stood, a ghost in a gilded cage, carrying plates for men who once shook her father's hand, who once praised his brilliance, and who now would not even recognize his daughter. The fall had been swift and merciless. 5 years earlier, Jonathan Monroe had staked his reputation on a painting he declared authentic, The Alchemist's Daughter, a supposed masterpiece lost to time. Weeks later, forensic evidence revealed it was a fraud. The scandal detonated across headlines. Renowned curator caught in forgery scandal. The man once respected by the Smithsonian, the Met, and every auction house in America was destroyed overnight. The world branded him a fraud. His career was incinerated, his reputation annihilated. And then, as if fate wished to twist the knife deeper, he suffered a massive stroke that left him half paralyzed, his brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. Clara, once a promising art history student at Columbia, dropped out overnight to care for him and her mother Helen, whose fragile heart buckled under the weight of disgrace and financial ruin. The Monroe brownstone in Georgetown was sold, their savings devoured by legal fees, their friends evaporated like morning mist. They were exiled to a small apartment in Queens, their lives shrinking as the world they once knew closed its doors forever. Now Clara walked the floors of the Concord, serving caviar to the very kind of people who had abandoned her family without a second thought. Every smile she gave was a mask. Every polite "yes, sir," and of course ma'am, was a dagger swallowed whole. She had learned patience, but it was not the meek patience of resignation. It was the sharpened patience of a hunter waiting for the right moment. Her only confidant was Sophia Alvarez, another waitress with a sharp wit and a tongue too quick for her own good. "How do you stand it?" Sophia had asked her, once polishing silverware in the back. "If another Wall Street guy snaps his fingers at me, I swear I'll stab him with this butter knife." Clara had only smiled faintly, her storm gray eyes glinting with something deeper. "Patience is a weapon, Sophia. You just have to know when to use it. Tonight, Clara carried herself as always professional and visible. Yet something in the air felt different. The clinking of glasses seemed sharper, the conversations hollower. She felt it in her chest, a subtle tightening, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. In the reflection of a polished silver tray, Clara caught her own gaze. She saw not just a tired young woman in a waitress's uniform, but a flame that no amount of disgrace could extinguish. She wasn't waiting tables. She was waiting for a chance. And though she didn't know it yet, that chance was about to walk through the door. At precisely 8:47 p.m., the maitre d' received a call, and the room seemed to shift. A name was whispered among the staff with urgency, the kind of name that carried power even in the halls of the elite. Damien Sterling, one of Wall Street's titans, a billionaire investor whose face was plastered across Forbes covers and television screens. Known for his ruthless takeovers, his lavish penthouses on Billionaire's Row, his arrogance that filled a room before he even stepped into it. And to Clara Monroe, he was not just another wealthy client. He was the man her father had named, in his dying whispers of clarity, the man Jonathan had accused of orchestrating the scandal that destroyed him. Clara froze in place, her fingers gripping the edge of her tray. She remembered her father's words, his voice trembling with fury years ago. That man believes there are two kinds of people in this world, people like us and people like them. And he buys and sells the latter for sport. Now fate had delivered him straight into her section of the Concord. Clara steadied her breathing, smoothed her apron, and lifted her chin. Her moment had come. To understand Clara Monroe's silence that night inside the Concord, one had to travel back 5 years to a time when her life had been draped in velvet rather than starched aprons. Jonathan Monroe had been a name synonymous with excellence. His lectures on Renaissance art drew standing ovations at Harvard and Yale. Auction houses in New York and London sought his expertise before daring to place a value on a canvas. A nod from him could elevate a painting into the tens of millions. For decades, he had been the conscience of art, respected not just in America, but across the world. And Clara had been his daughter, his pride, his protege. She had walked through museum corridors as if they were her birthright, discussing chiaroscuro and brushstrokes at an age when most children struggled with multiplication tables. Her path had been carved, promising inevitable Columbia University, then graduate studies in Paris or Rome, and eventually her own name etched into the world of art history. But destinies can collapse in a single moment. That moment came with a painting, The Alchemist's Daughter. It was hailed as a rediscovered masterpiece by Johannes Vermeer, a work whispered about in old catalogs, but thought lost forever. When it emerged from the shadows of a European collection, the art world trembled. Was it real? If so, its value would be immeasurable. Jonathan Monroe examined it personally. Weeks of analysis, sleepless nights with magnifying lenses, chemical tests. At a press conference in Washington, he declared it authentic. A window into the soul of the Dutch Golden Age, he called it. His voice trembled with pride. The world applauded. The price soared. Investors celebrated. And then 6 months later, the rug was pulled from beneath him. A new report surfaced conducted by an independent scientific lab claiming the pigments were modern imitations. The cracks in the paint, once believed to be centuries of natural aging, were artificially induced. It was a forgery, brilliant, audacious, but a forgery nonetheless. The same journalists who had praised Jonathan now eviscerated him. How could the great Monroe be so blind? Headlines screamed. Late-night hosts turned him into a punchline. Colleagues distanced themselves. Friends stopped returning calls. But the truth, Clara remembered, was darker. Jonathan had confided in her one evening, his hands shaking as he poured bourbon into a glass. "It doesn't add up, Clara. The science isn't wrong, but neither was my eye. Something's been manipulated. Someone has orchestrated this." And then he spoke a name, Damien Sterling. Sterling had been a financial partner in the acquisition, a man with enormous money at stake. Jonathan suspected he had known the painting was false, that he had engineered the narrative, fed the evidence, and made Jonathan the perfect scapegoat. Sterling profited from Jonathan's fall. Shares of the painting were pre-sold to investors at astronomical prices, only for Sterling to acquire it quietly for himself. When the scandal hit, what had once been a crown jewel became his private trophy. The revelation came too late. The pressure, the humiliation, the endless cameras camped outside their Georgetown home. It broke Jonathan. He collapsed in his study one evening, his body betraying him in a single catastrophic stroke. Clara had been the one to find him. His face twisted, his words trapped in his throat. Her mother, Helen, fared no better. Fragile by nature, she had always relied on Jonathan's stability. Watching him unravel destroyed her spirit. Her health deteriorated, and with it, their finances. The brownstone was sold to pay debts. The savings vanished into lawyers' pockets. The name Monroe, once spoken with reverence, became synonymous with disgrace. Clara remembered the last night in their home. She had wandered through the library, where she once spent hours beside her father tracing the spines of books that had shaped civilizations. She touched the piano keys her mother once played their sound hollow in the empty room. And then she walked out, clutching a single leather trunk that contained remnants of her former life, her father's journals, her mother's pearls, a handful of photographs. From Georgetown to Queens was not just a move, it was exile. Clara left Columbia abandoning her degree. Instead, she took the first job she could find that would cover the rent and her mother's prescription's waitress at the Concord. It was bitter irony. Every night she bowed her head before the same class of people who had destroyed her family, delivering meals to those who still dined on privilege while she carried their scraps. But Clara did not break. She transformed her suffering into silence, her anger into patience. She trained herself to walk with poise, to speak with restraint, to make herself invisible. For years she lived as a ghost, saving every ounce of strength for something larger, something she could not yet name. Her father, though broken, remained her anchor. Though his speech was slurred, his mind still glowed with brilliance. When she read his journals to him at night, his eyes would sharpen, his hand gripping hers in wordless solidarity. Those journals contained notes he had written before the scandal, observations about pigments, doubts about authenticity, whispers of fraud. They were fragments, but to Clara, they were seeds of truth, waiting to bloom. Her mother, frail and dependent, gave her a different kind of strength. Every time Clara watched Helen struggle to climb the stairs, or ration medication, a blade of resolve cut deeper into her heart. She would not allow Sterling or anyone to continue living at the top while her family suffered at the bottom. And so Clara endured year after year. She poured wine for billionaires, smiled at men who looked past her, carried plates heavier than her pride. All the while, she waited. Sophia once teased her, "You act like you're in training for something, Clara, like you're a soldier hiding in enemy territory." Clara had only replied with a faint smile, "Maybe I am." The world saw her as nothing, but in truth she was sharpening herself into a weapon. And on the night Damian Sterling walked into the Concord, that weapon was about to be unsheathed. The double glass doors of the Concord parted with the kind of silence that comes from design, not accident. They didn't creak. They didn't sigh. They opened as if they had been waiting for him. Damian Sterling entered as though the restaurant belonged to him. In a sense, it did. His money had secured the restaurant group's expansion. His name carried weight on Wall Street in Washington, in every boardroom where deals were made behind closed doors. The staff knew it. The patrons knew it. And Clara Monroe, standing frozen near the sommelier's station, knew it more intimately than anyone. Sterling was tall, broad-shouldered, his tailored Tom Ford suit fitting him like armor. His wrist gleamed with a Patek Philippe timepiece so rare, its price was whispered rather than spoken. His salt and pepper hair was combed back with precision, his smile a weaponized curve of white teeth. But it wasn't his appearance that filled the room with static. It was the certainty, the dangerous certainty, that every inch of this space, every eye that glanced at him, every whisper that followed him, was already his. On his arm was Isabel Hart, a woman who looked less like a companion and more like an accessory selected for the evening. She was painfully thin, draped in a designer gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, her diamonds catching the light like sharp fragments of ice. Her laugh, high-pitched, rehearsed, rang too quickly at Sterling's every smirk. "Sterling party of two," he announced to the hostess, not as a request, not even as a reservation, but as a declaration. The hostess nodded, her professionalism nearly faltering under the weight of his presence. "Right this way, Miss Sterling." They were led to the most coveted corner table, one with a panoramic view of Central Park glowing beneath the Manhattan skyline. The table fell within Clara's section. Her hands tightened around the tray she carried. A small tremor threatened to betray her composure. This was it, the moment she had both feared and waited for. The man her father had named with venom, the man whose greed had detonated her family's life, was sitting 10 feet away. Clara inhaled slowly, the way she had taught herself in the quiet hours after midnight when panic used to claw at her chest. She smoothed her apron, straightened her back, and stepped forward. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm, smooth, perfectly neutral. "My name is Clara, and I'll be your server tonight. May I begin with water for the table?" Damien didn't look up. His attention was fixed on the phone in his hand, where a glowing chart of stock prices scrolled across the screen. He lifted one manicured hand in a dismissive wave. "Bring us the 98 Petrus," he said flatly, "and don't shake it." It wasn't a request. It was an order, the way one might address a subordinate in a boardroom. Clara's gaze flickered briefly to the bottle in her mind. The Petrus 1998, a Bordeaux, worth $12,000. "An excellent choice, sir," she replied with poise, her tone revealing none of the heat she felt in her chest. She turned to Isabel. "And for you, madam?" Isabel looked startled, as if she hadn't expected to be acknowledged. "Oh, I'll have what he's having." Clara inclined her head gracefully and walked away, her steps measured. Behind her, Sterling's voice lowered to a rumble, boastful and cold. He was recounting to Isabel the details of his latest acquisition. A rival company gutted and dismantled, thousands of livelihoods reduced to numbers on a balance sheet. Isabel laughed on cue, though her eyes were glazed. At the wine cellar, Clara steadied herself. The cool air of the vault wrapped around her as she located the bottle hand steady, despite the fury building within her. Years of training in silence had taught her this, to move with grace, even when her insides screamed. She carried the bottle back with the ceremony required, presenting it to Sterling, with the formality drilled into her. He glanced at the label, gave a perfunctory nod. "Open it." Clara uncorked it with flawless precision. The foil cut cleanly, the cork drawn in silence, the liquid poured into crystal as smoothly as water from a mountain stream. She placed the decanter gently on the table and poured a tasting glass. Sterling swirled the wine with exaggerated gestures, sniffed with the air of a man trying on a roll, and took a sip. "Acceptable," he declared. Clara's lips curved into the faintest, most controlled smile. She bowed slightly and withdrew, disappearing back into the rhythm of service. For the next hour, she became a phantom. She moved in and out of their space, setting down plates of beluga caviar, replenishing wine glasses, clearing dishes, all while absorbing every word Sterling spoke. His conversation was an endless monologue of self-congratulation, yachts, mergers, private islands, political donations. Isabel nodded, laughed, tilted her head as though enraptured. But to Clara, every syllable was poison. Every boast was a reminder of how easily this man had destroyed her father's life. It wasn't until the caviar course that Sterling finally acknowledged her. As Clara laid the mother-of-pearl spoons on the table, he glanced up at her. Not to see her, but to use her as one might use a prop. His lips curved into a conspiratorial smirk as he leaned toward Isabel. Then, with deliberate arrogance, he began to speak in French. His accent was atrocious, butchered, but his words were unmistakable. "Regardez-la," he murmured. "Look at her. This poor little thing. Works so hard for crumbs. I wonder if she has ever tasted more than scraps from the kitchen. Isabel giggled a brittle sound that shattered the air. Oh, Damien, you're awful. He smirked wider, pleased with himself. That's life, my sweet. There are people like us, and people like them. The words struck Clara like a shard of ice. Her body stilled. The sound of the restaurant dimmed into a hollow roar. Her breath caught in her chest, because she had heard those exact words before. Her father had repeated them 5 years ago, his face pale with fury after a phone call. That man, Damien Sterling, believes there are two kinds of people in this world. People like us and people like them. And he thinks he can buy and sell the latter for sport. Clara's fingers tightened around the tray until her knuckles whitened. The years of humiliation, the swallowed rage, the endless patience, it all sharpened into a single point of clarity. This wasn't just arrogance. This was destiny circling back like a storm. Sterling, oblivious, took another sip of his wine, expecting her to fade back into silence, into invisibility. But for the first time in 5 years, Clara Monroe felt the mask of servitude begin to crack. And behind it was not a waitress, not a servant. Behind it was a daughter forged in disgrace, carrying the quiet fire of vengeance. The room was alive with laughter, glassware chiming the murmur of high society's chatter. But for Clara Monroe, the sound receded into a dull echo. Time itself seemed to contract, narrowing to the space between her and Damien Sterling. His words still burned in her ears. There are people like us, and people like them. It wasn't just the insult that froze her. It was the memory. It unlocked. Her father's trembling voice. After that final call, his fury and despair condensed into one damning sentence. That man thinks he can buy and sell people like them for sport. Sterling leaned back in his chair, oblivious to the storm he had stirred. He smirked, savoring the cruel joke, pleased by Isabel Hart's simpering giggle. To him, Clara was nothing more than a shadow with a tray, an object to be dismissed. He didn't notice her spine straighten. He didn't see the shift in her eyes, the storm clouds gathering after years of quiet endurance. Clara inhaled slowly, her pulse hammering, but her voice calm as still water when she finally spoke. Monsieur? The single word sliced through the air like a blade. Sterling's smirk faltered. He blinked, his glass of wine hovering just short of his lips. Isabel's laughter died in her throat, confusion spreading across her perfect features. Clara leaned slightly forward, not enough to break the decorum of service, but enough to command attention. Her voice, when it came again, was low, resonant, and flawless. The voice of a Parisian salon, not a queen's waitress. If you wish to insult me in French, Mr. Sterling, she said, each syllable crisp, immaculate, devastating. I suggest you first master the language beyond the level of a tourist asking for directions to the restroom. A hush fell over the table. Sterling froze, his jaw slack, his eyes widening as though he'd seen a ghost. For years, his wealth had shielded him from consequence, his arrogance unchecked. But in that moment, Clara's words pierced through his armor with surgical precision. She didn't stop. The years of humiliation had sharpened her tongue into a weapon, and now it was unleashed. Your accent, she continued, her gaze unflinching, is as clumsy as your manners. And as for what I have or have not tasted, her lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. Know that I was raised in a world for which you only wear the costume. The words landed with the force of truth. Isabel's wide eyes darted between them, her confusion deepening into unease. Sterling's hand trembled around his crystal glass, a droplet of wine spilling onto the linen. For the first time in his life, Damien Sterling had no script, no quip, no shield of power. He had been outplayed by the very person he dismissed as beneath him. Clara held his gaze a beat longer, her silence now as powerful as her words. Then, with breathtaking poise, she straightened, placed the silver tray under her arm, and in perfect English said, "Please enjoy your caviar, sir." She pivoted smoothly, her back straight, her steps measured, and walked away. The air around the table hung heavy, charged. Sterling's face was pale, His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched at his temple. Isabel fidgeted her diamonds, catching the candlelight, but she offered no laughter this time. She simply sipped her wine in silence, unsure whether to comfort him or fear him. Clara, meanwhile, moved through the restaurant with calm precision. Her hands trembled faintly under the cover of her tray, adrenaline roaring in her veins. She passed a table of investment bankers arguing over market futures, another of socialites whispering behind manicured nails, and finally slipped into the sanctuary of the service corridor. She exhaled. Her body felt electrified, her mind ablaze. For years, she had been invisible, a ghost waiting for her moment. And tonight she had risen from the shadows, not with violence, not with desperation, but with the weapon her parents had given. Her culture, knowledge, refinement. Inside the dining room, Damian Sterling sat in stunned silence. For the first time, someone had turned his own arrogance into his undoing. But beneath the humiliation was something darker. Something Clara had noticed as she delivered the blow. Fear. Because in her voice, in her flawless French, in her unshakable poise, Sterling had recognized something he thought buried forever. The name Monroe. The ghost of a scandal he believed he had silenced. Clara leaned against the cool stainless steel of the kitchen counter, her chest heaving as Sofia Alvarez appeared beside her. "What happened out there?" Sofia whispered, eyes wide. "You look like you just walked through fire." Clara's lips parted, her voice barely above a breath. "Worse," she said. "I looked a monster in the eye." Before Sofia could ask more, the kitchen door swung open with a violent slam. The manager, Charles Dubois, stood framed in the doorway, his face a thundercloud. His French accent, usually polished and warm, was sharp with fury. "Monroe," he barked, his eyes drilling into her. "My office. Now." The room fell silent. Every cook, every server, every dishwasher turned to watch. A summons to Dubois's office during service could mean only one thing: termination. Clara wiped her damp palms against her apron, steadied her breath, and walked forward. But unlike so many nights before, she felt no fear. Sterling could demand her dismissal. Dubois could comply. The Concord could close its doors to her forever. But none of that mattered. For the first time in 5 years, Clara Monroe had spoken. And in the ruins of Sterling's smirk, she had found something far more valuable than her job. She had found her weapon. The office was small, windowless, and suffocating. The hum of refrigeration units seeped faintly through the walls, the only reminder that just beyond this door was a kitchen, alive with fire and steel. But here in Charles Dubois's cramped domain, silence reigned. Clara sat rigidly on the hard chair opposite his desk, her uniform pressed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her posture was controlled, but inside her veins still roared with the echo of adrenaline. Dubois lowered himself into his leather chair with slow deliberation. His face, usually impassive, was drawn taut, his sharp features clouded with irritation. Or was it concern? He steepled his fingers, eyes locked on her with the scrutiny of a judge. "Explain," he said finally, his French accent clipped the word, cutting the air like a blade. Clara did not flinch. "He insulted me," she said evenly. Dubois raised one brow. "Mr. Sterling informs the hostess that he was insulted in his own language. He demands your immediate dismissal." You are aware, of course, that Mr. Sterling is not merely a guest, but one of the most influential investors in this restaurant group. The weight of his words pressed against the air, but Clara refused to bend beneath it. She lifted her chin. "Yes, I am aware. And I am also aware that his attempt at French was little more than mockery. He believed I would not understand. He called me a poor little thing, surviving on scraps. He ridiculed my place in this world." Dubois's eyes narrowed. "And your reply?" Her voice grew sharper, colder, as she recalled the exchange. "I told him that if he wished to criticize me in French, he should first learn the language properly. I told him his accent was as clumsy as his manners, and I reminded him that the world he pretends to belong to is the one I was raised in." A long silence followed. Dubois leaned back slowly, studying her as though recalibrating his understanding. His gaze shifted from suspicion to curiosity, from irritation to something like respect. "Monroe, he said quietly, this time pronouncing the name differently. Of course. I knew I recognized that refinement. Tell me, what is your story? The question struck her like a bell tolling in the night. No one had asked her that in years. She had been invisible too long. But now in this cramped office, she chose not to hide. My father is Jonathan Monroe, she said simply. The name fell heavy between them. Dubois's eyes widened, recognition dawning instantly. He whispered, as though to himself, the curator. The scandal. Clara nodded once. The scandal that was orchestrated by Damien Sterling. My father was silenced before he could reveal the truth. I grew up in a house where art was not just studied, it was revered. And I watched that house be burned to the ground by one man's greed. Dubois exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. For years, he had run the Concorde with military precision, shielding it from politics and scandal. Yet now sitting across from him was not a waitress, but the daughter of a man whose name had once carried weight in the same world Sterling sought to dominate. I should fire you, he said at last. It would be easier. Cleaner. Sterling could not touch me if you were gone. But... His voice dropped lower. There is a part of me, the part that still believes in excellence, that cannot allow a vulgar man like him to dictate the fate of someone who possesses what he will never buy class. Clara's breath caught, though she kept her face composed. Dubois waved a hand dismissively. You are not dismissed. Take the rest of the night off on full pay. Go home to your family. But understand this, Mademoiselle Monroe. His gaze sharpened, warning. A man like Sterling does not forgive humiliation. He will retaliate. Be careful. For the first time in years, Clara felt something other than rage or exhaustion. She felt the faint stirrings of solidarity. She rose and inclined her head with quiet dignity. Thank you, monsieur. Go, he said, though a flicker of a smile ghosted across his lips. And remember, patience is a weapon. The night air outside the Concorde was cool, sharp, carrying the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner. Clara walked with measured steps, her reflection in the glass skyscrapers shifting with every stride. For years, the city had seemed like a wall pressing her down. Tonight, it felt like a battlefield opening before her. By the time she reached their modest apartment in Queens, the adrenaline had worn thin, replaced by a heavy, pulsing exhaustion. But when she opened the door, the sight inside reignited her resolve. Her mother, Helen, sat asleep in a worn armchair. A thin blanket draped over her fragile frame, a book of poetry slipping from her hands. The lamplight painted her face, with shadows highlighting the toll of illness and years of sorrow. Clara gently picked up the book, placed a bookmark between the pages, and tucked the blanket more securely around her mother's shoulders. For a moment she stood there watching her, once a woman radiant at Washington galas, now diminished by grief. Clara's chest tightened. Sterling had stolen more than money and reputation. He had stolen her mother's joy. She moved quietly to her father's room. Jonathan Monroe sat by the window in his wheelchair, eyes sharp, despite the body that betrayed him. When he turned his head and saw her, he seemed to sense immediately that something had shifted. Clara knelt by his side, taking his good hand in hers. Her voice was low, steady, but burning with intensity. "Papa," she whispered, "I saw him tonight. Damien Sterling." Her father's hand convulsed, a guttural sound escaping his lips, the closest he could come to words. His eyes blazed, fury and pain merging into one. "He tried to humiliate me," Clara continued, her tone hardening. "But I did not stay silent. I answered him in your language, in mother's language." And for the first time in years, he was afraid. A single tear slid down Jonathan's cheek. His grip on her hand tightened, fierce, filled with pride. His eyes, though wordless, spoke volumes. Clara stood crossed to the corner of the room and pulled out the worn leather trunk she had buried beneath her bed. Inside lay fragments of her old life photographs, books, relics of another world, and at the bottom, her father's journals. She carried them to the desk and began to flip through the pages. His elegant handwriting danced across them, observations on pigments, doubts about authenticity, notes on conversations with Sterling. And then she found it. An entry dated weeks before the scandal erupted. His words trembled with urgency. Something is wrong. The pigment's composition is too uniform, too perfect. Consistent with the 17th century but missing the imperfections. Manufactured. Her breath caught. Page after page revealed the same progression: suspicion, confrontation, desperation. Jonathan had written that he planned to confront Sterling with his findings. He had even arranged for independent analysis, an analysis that never surfaced. Clara closed the journal slowly, her pulse pounding. The truth was here. Sterling hadn't just ruined her father. He had silenced him, destroyed evidence, and built his empire on the ashes of their name. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window, the city lights flickering behind her. The waitress was gone. What remained was Clara Monroe, forged in disgrace, armed with patience, and now finally with a target. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn. Sleep had been shallow, broken by flashes of Sterling's smirk, dissolving into panic by the sound of her father's guttural cry of rage, by the weight of the journals now resting on her desk like silent dynamite. The leather-bound volumes were fragile from years of handling, but the words inside were sharper than any blade. Dates, pigment, analysis, underdrawing sketches, even references to conversations with Sterling, all preserved in her father's elegant script. For years they had been relics of her grief, too painful to touch. But last night had changed everything. Her father's journals weren't just memories. They were evidence. Clara knew she couldn't wage this battle alone. Sterling's power stretched across Wall Street and Washington. He had allies in boardrooms, politicians in his pocket, and the resources to bury anyone who dared challenge him. She needed someone who understood how to fight men like him, someone who knew how to drag monsters out of the shadows and into the light. There was only one name that came to mind: Arthur Finch. Once Arthur had been the lion of investigative journalism. His exposés on corporate fraud and political corruption had toppled CEOs, ended congressional careers, and earned him both Pulitzer nominations and powerful enemies. He was known for chasing truth with a ruthlessness that mirrored the very people he exposed. But 5 years ago, after clashing with Sterling's network of influence, Arthur had been forced into early retirement. Clara remembered his lone article that questioned the Monroe scandal. While the world condemned her father, Arthur had dared to write, "The narrative is too clean, the evidence too convenient." When stories fit this perfectly, it often means someone is writing the script. The article had been buried, ignored by the mainstream, but Clara had never forgotten it. Finding him wasn't easy. Arthur had retreated from the public eye, vanishing into the city like a ghost. She searched old press directories, followed digital breadcrumbs, until finally one lead took her to a dusty bookstore in the East Village. The final word. The shop looked as though it had been forgotten by time. Its windows were streaked with grime, the sign faded, its shelves groaning under the weight of books, stacked like crumbling monuments. The bell above the door chimed weakly as Clara stepped inside. Behind the counter sat a man who looked as worn as the books he guarded. His gray hair thinned at the crown, his clothes rumpled his glasses, slipping down his nose as he read a yellowed newspaper. His expression was one of habitual cynicism. The face of someone who had seen too much of humanity's rot. "We close in 5 minutes," he muttered without looking up. "Mr. Finch," Clara said, her voice steady. The newspaper lowered slowly. Sharp blue eyes peered over the rims of his glasses, scrutinizing her with sudden alertness. "Who wants to know?" "My name is Clara Monroe," she replied, stepping forward. "My father was Jonathan Monroe." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Arthur's brows lifted, his posture straightening slightly. "I remember," he said slowly. "The scandal. That was quite a story." "It wasn't a story," Clara said firmly. "It was sabotage." She placed one of her father's journals on the counter. The leather was cracked, the pages lined with her father's looping script. This is his private record. His doubts, his findings, written before the scandal broke. He knew the alchemist's daughter was a forgery. He was about to expose Sterling when the evidence vanished, and he was framed. Arthur's hand hovered over the journal, not touching it yet, as though it were sacred. The cynicism in his eyes flickered, replaced by something sharper: interest. Predatory interest. Every bitter daughter thinks she has proof. He rasped, testing her. Why should I believe this isn't just another desperate attempt to rewrite history? Clara leaned forward, her voice cool, precise. Because my father had a stroke 5 years ago. He hasn't been able to write his own name since. These entries are real-time dated before his fall. And because in these pages he describes something specific, an underdrawing in the sleeve, a cross-hatched signature he recognized from a known 20th century forger, he sent for independent analysis. That report never saw daylight. Do you think that's coincidence? Arthur's fingers finally touched the leather, tracing it with reverence. He opened the book slowly, scanning a page, then another. His lips moved as he read, his eyes narrowing, the old fire flickering back to life. A diary can be dismissed, he said gruffly, still testing her. Sterling will say your father wrote this after the scandal to save himself. Clara didn't blink. Then how do you explain that he hasn't written a coherent sentence since? How do you explain the forger's signature? He described something that can still be proven today with the right equipment. My father wasn't inventing excuses. He was recording the truth. Sterling buried it. I intend to dig it up. For a moment silence stretched between them. The dusty shop seemed to hold its breath. Then Arthur closed the journal and exhaled a long, heavy sigh. When he looked up, his eyes were no longer bored. They were alive, sharp, dangerous. All right, kid, he said. You've got my attention. But to nail a man like Sterling, you need more than a book. You need proof the world can't deny. Hard evidence. Something you can put on a screen in front of a crowd and watch him burn. Clara's voice was calm, but her eyes blazed. Then we'll get it. Arthur leaned back, studying her as if seeing not a waitress but a soldier. You're your father's daughter, he murmured, and Sterling has no idea what's coming. The plan began to form that very afternoon in the dim light of the final word. They sketched it out over mugs of bitter coffee, how Sterling's penthouse on Billionaire's Row housed the alchemist's daughter, how they would need high-resolution multispectral images to reveal the forged signature beneath the paint. It was madness. Sterling's penthouse was a fortress. His security detail rivaled a head of states. But Arthur's grin was feral. His ego may be articulate, he said. He's desperate for legitimacy. Just hired a private curator to catalog his collection. A young academic, my nephew Alistair Finch. Brilliant but hopelessly naive. We'll use him to get you inside. Clara listened, her resolve hardening with every word. Fear curled at the edges of her stomach, but determination burned hotter. She was no longer a ghost in a uniform. She was a hunter stepping into her first alliance. For years, she had waited. Now, with Arthur Finch by her side, she was ready to move. Damian Sterling had built an empire on lies. Clara Monroe was going to dismantle it with truth, and the first brick would fall from inside his own walls. The storm had been gathering for days. Now it was time to step inside it. Clara Monroe had shed the skin of a waitress. The apron and tray were gone. In their place was Anna Carter, a freelance art photographer with an impeccable resume, fabricated by Arthur Finch with a skill honed over decades of bending truth into unassailable narratives. Her clothing was her armor. A tailored charcoal gray dress, understated yet intellectual, paired with tortoiseshell glasses, and a discreet leather portfolio. Her hair, usually bound tightly for restaurant shifts, now swept into a soft, professional chignon. The transformation was meticulous. She no longer looked like a server blending into the shadows of the Concord. She looked like a scholar who belonged in Sterling's curated world. Arthur met her for coffee before the meeting, his weathered hands wrapped around the mug, eyes sharp beneath tired lids. "Remember, you're not Clara tonight," he said. "You're Anna, quiet, detached, competent. Sterling will look at you and see nothing more than another academic validating his ego. That's your cloak. Use it." She nodded, her jaw tight. "I'm ready." Arthur studied her for a moment longer. Then, almost fatherly, he reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Don't underestimate him. He's a predator. But remember this, he's also arrogant. and arrogance blinds. Sterling's penthouse loomed high above Midtown Manhattan, a glass monolith perched on Billionaire's Row. When Clara arrived, escorted by Arthur's nephew, Alistair Finch, she paused to take in the sheer scale of it. The doorman checked credentials with clinical efficiency, then waved them through to a private elevator that shot them 58 floors into the sky. The doors opened into a world of curated wealth. Sterling's penthouse wasn't a home. It was a gallery, a fortress of acquisitions. Rothko canvases stretched like muted flames across the walls. A Warhol hung near the dining alcove, its colors clashing with the marble austerity. But the crown jewel dominated the center of the living space, the alchemist's daughter. Even from across the room, the painting radiated false beauty. Its subject, a young girl rendered in soft Vermeer-like light, seemed almost alive, her eyes luminous, her sleeve delicately shaded. To the untrained eye, it was a masterpiece. To Clara, it was a lie that had destroyed her family. Her pulse quickened. Damien Sterling emerged from an adjoining study wearing a cashmere tracksuit that likely cost more than a year's rent in Queens. His presence filled the room, his smile as sharp as a blade. Mr. Sterling, Alistair began nervously adjusting his tweed jacket. "This is Anna Carter, the documentarian I mentioned. She'll be capturing your collection for archival purposes." Sterling's reptilian eyes swept over Clara, dismissive in an instant. He didn't recognize her. To him, she was just another academic, another hired hand. "Fine," he grunted, already glancing back at his phone. "Alistair, supervise, and make sure she doesn't touch anything." Clara inclined her head respectfully, her voice neutral. "Of course, Mr. Sterling, this will be strictly observational." The dismissal was her shield. As long as he saw nothing, she could move freely. She began with smaller works, photographing a Degas sketch, a Pollock study, snapping meticulously, documenting as any professional would. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled. Each click of the shutter was a rehearsal, a step closer to her true target. Finally, she stood before the alchemist's daughter. Her chest tightened, but her face remained composed. She adjusted her tripod, mounted her infrared-capable lens, and spoke to Alistair in her practiced academic tone. "Given its provenance, I'll need multispectral imaging for insurance records." Alistair nodded eagerly. "Of course, Sterling, you hear that? This will be very thorough." Sterling barely looked up, too absorbed in his stock tickers. "Whatever. Just make it quick." Clara bent to her work. Through the viewfinder, the painted surface appeared flawless. But as the infrared processed on her small digital screen, something ghostly began to emerge beneath the pigments. Her father's words rang in her memory. The sleeve look for the cross-hatching. A forger's fingerprint. And there it was. The faint geometric lines, a pattern of strokes, invisible to the naked eye, etched like a secret beneath the paint. Distinctive, undeniable. The signature of a 20th-century forger. Clara's throat tightened. Her eyes burned. She took a dozen shots, angles overlapping, each more detailed than the last. Every image was a blade forged in silence, now aimed at Sterling's empire. She slipped the files to an encrypted drive, then wiped the camera's internal memory. To Alistair, it looked like routine documentation. To Sterling, it looked like validation. But in truth, she had just stolen the weapon that would destroy him. As she packed her gear, Sterling sauntered over. His eyes lingered on the painting, his voice laced with self-satisfaction. "Impressive, isn't it?" he said. "My Vermeer." Clara turned to face him, her expression perfectly bland, her voice cool and professional. "It is a compelling piece, Mr. Sterling, a fascinating subject for technical analysis." Her detachment pleased him. He nodded, smug, convinced he had been admired. "Of course it is," he said. "Only someone with vision could have acquired it." Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, her face a mask, her fury hidden beneath the stillness. Then she bowed her head slightly, murmured, "Thank you for your time," and followed Alistair toward the elevator. Each step felt like walking with a detonator in her pocket. Back at the final word, Arthur Finch waited like a general awaiting reconnaissance. When Clara handed him the encrypted drive, his hands trembled despite years of hardened cynicism. He loaded the files onto his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his worn features. As the first infrared image appeared, the old lion let out a low whistle. "There it is," he muttered, "clear as daylight. Your father was right. Sterling didn't just profit from fraud, he built his empire on it." Clara's breath shook as she leaned forward, staring at the forger's signature circled in red pixels. Proof. Hard, unshakable proof. For the first time since her father's disgrace, she didn't feel like she was carrying ashes. She was carrying fire. Arthur closed the laptop, his eyes glittering. "We have the cannonball. Now we need the stage. Somewhere public, where he can't bury it, where the world has to watch." Clara's answer came instantly, her voice hard, resolute. "His gala. 2 weeks from now, he'll parade himself before the elite, offering them another fraud to buy into. That's where we'll end it." Arthur smiled, the grim, wolfish smile of a man who had toppled giants before. "Then let's make sure the king hangs himself with his own rope." That night, Clara stood at her window, overlooking Queens. The skyline glittered, the towers of wealth and arrogance gleaming like false gods. For years, she had served in their shadows. Now she held the power to burn one of them to the ground. Her father's words echoed in her memory. Patience is a weapon. She had been patient. Now came the strike. The days leading to the gala passed like the tightening of a noose. New York pulsed with its usual rhythm horns, blaring down Fifth Avenue, stock tickers running red and green across Times Square, sirens wailing in the distance. But for Clara Monroe, the city no longer pressed her down. It felt like a battlefield where every sound was part of the drumbeat of destiny. Her apartment in Queens had transformed into a war room. The small dining table, once cluttered with bills and medicine bottles, now held blueprints of Sterling's empire, timelines, news clippings, financial reports, and above all, her father's journals. Arthur Finch had brought with him the sharp smell of old paper and black coffee pacing the floor, like a general in exile. "You can't go in there as Jonathan Monroe's grieving daughter," he warned one evening, stabbing the air with his pen. "Sterling will paint you as hysterical, a bitter ghost clinging to the ashes of her father's name. No, you go in there as something he doesn't expect, an authority, calm, factual, unshakable." Clara nodded, her storm-colored eyes steady. "I will." Arthur leaned closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "Remember, emotion is his weapon. He thrives on it. Anger, humiliation, chaos. You don't give him any. You bury him under the one thing he cannot outspend or silence." "The truth," Clara said softly. Arthur's lips twisted into a grim smile. "Exactly." The evidence was already a loaded gun. Dr. Isabella Rossi, her father's old colleague in Florence, had returned her analysis of the multispectral images. The email had come through encrypted channels, the subject line stark, for Jean-Luc. Always. Her report was devastating. It confirmed the anomalies in pigment, the unnatural composition of the lead tin yellow, the manufactured perfection that betrayed a modern hand. Most damning of all were the side-by-side comparisons. The cross-hatching signature in The Alchemist's Daughter matched flawlessly with a known forger's works from the mid-20th century. Her conclusion was absolute. The painting is a forgery, beyond doubt, scientifically irrefutable. Arthur's eyes had gleamed when he read it. This is our cannonball. But Clara knew evidence alone wasn't enough. Evidence had buried her father before. This time it needed a stage so bright, so public, that not even Sterling's billions could smother it. And that stage was his own creation. Every year, Damien Sterling hosted his patrons' gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, draping himself in philanthropy while displaying his most prized acquisitions. The elite came in diamonds and tuxedos, the press cameras flashed, and Sterling bathed in adoration. This year, he intended to unveil a charcoal study, allegedly the preparatory sketch for The Alchemist's Daughter. Clara felt a chill when Arthur relayed the news. Sterling wasn't content with displaying the forgery. He was doubling down, selling his lie to the highest bidder. "It's perfect," Arthur had said, his voice thick with grim satisfaction. "He's handing us the stage himself. We'll bring the truth, where he cannot run from it. Preparation became ritual. By day, Clara pored over her father's journals again, memorizing his words, internalizing the cadence of his handwriting so it would not falter when she spoke his name. By night, she trained with Arthur on delivery, rehearsing the calm, surgical voice of a professional, not the wounded cry of a victim. He made her stand in front of a cracked mirror posture, straight eyes unwavering. "Say it again," he ordered. "My father was not a criminal." Clara repeated, her voice ringing with clarity. He was silenced. Arthur's tired eyes gleamed. "Good. Sharper. Again." They rehearsed late into the night until her voice carried the rhythm of conviction, not grief. The final piece was appearance. If she was to face Sterling under the blazing chandeliers of the Met, she could not arrive as a waitress in black and white, or as a scholar in borrowed tweed. She had to walk into that temple of art, as the woman Sterling had tried to erase the daughter of Jonathan Monroe, raised among gallery openings and embassy halls. Arthur advanced her the money. "Consider it an investment," he said dryly, though his eyes softened as he watched her hesitate. At a small boutique tucked on Madison Avenue, Clara found a vintage sapphire silk gown, elegant without ostentation, timeless in its cut. The fabric shimmered faintly under light, catching her stormy eyes. It wasn't about wealth, it was about legacy. Her hair, styled into a graceful chignon, exposed her neck with quiet authority. On her ears, the only jewelry she owned of real value, a pair of pearl drops that had once belonged to her mother. When she looked in the mirror, she saw no trace of the waitress who cleared tables, no trace of the student forced to abandon her degree. She saw Clara Monroe, her father's daughter, her mother's heir, a woman forged in loss and sharpened into a weapon. The night of the gala arrived cold and brilliant. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed like a beacon. Its marble steps crowded with black cars, photographers, and the glittering elite of New York. Flashbulbs strobed against gowns of gold and emerald, against diamonds cut like stars. Clara stepped from the cab with Arthur Finch at her side. The old journalist, rumpled in his suit, looked wonderfully out of place among the polished financiers and socialites. But his presence was steady grounding. The crowd barely noticed her at first. To them, she was simply another guest, her sapphire gown blending among jewels and silk. But as she ascended the steps, the chandeliers spilling golden light across her shoulders, heads began to turn. There was something in her carriage, in the storm calm of her eyes, that set her apart. Inside, the Temple of Dender glittered under candlelight, transformed into Sterling's court for the night. Waiters moved through the crowd with champagne flutes, a string quartet played Vivaldi, and beneath the echoing arches, the city's elite congratulated themselves on their generosity. And there at the center was Damian Sterling himself. He was incandescent with pride, his tuxedo flawless, his voice booming with charm as he shook hands and accepted praise. Isabel sparkled at his side, a trophy dripping in diamonds. Cameras flashed around him, recording every smile. Clara's eyes locked on him across the hall. Her pulse slowed, steady as a drumbeat. For 5 years she had lived as a ghost. Tonight she would step out of the shadows. Arthur touched her arm lightly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes bright with fire. When the moment comes, he murmured, "Don't speak as his enemy. Speak as the truth. That's how you'll bury him." Clara nodded, her lips set in a thin, resolute line. The air hummed with tension as the auctioneer stepped onto the stage, preparing to unveil the charcoal sketch Sterling was offering. The trap was set, the stage was lit, and Clara Monroe was ready to haunt the man who thought he had buried her. The Temple of Dender glittered under chandeliers, as though pharaohs themselves had risen to witness the spectacle. The air smelled of champagne, orchids, and money. Guests leaned forward in anticipation as the auctioneer stepped onto the stage, his voice booming with theatrical cadence. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's centerpiece, a rare charcoal sketch believed to be the preparatory study for The Alchemist's Daughter, courtesy of our esteemed host, Mr. Damian Sterling." Applause thundered. Sterling stood nearby, basking in it like a king anointed by his court. Isabel clung to his arm, her diamonds winking beneath the lights. Cameras captured every angle, ready to immortalize the evening in glossy spreads. The sketch was unveiled, a simple study, dark lines forming the shape of the girl who haunted Clara's family, like a specter. To the crowd, it was history. To Clara, it was another lie. The bidding began at $100,000. Hands shot up without hesitation. Numbers escalated with the fever of ego, 6 figures climbing toward 7. Each bid gilded Sterling's fraud with another layer of validation. Clara's heart pounded. The moment pressed against her like a wave threatening to drown. Arthur stood at her side, his face lined with tension but his nod steady. Now. She stepped forward. Wait. The word was not shouted, but it sliced through the auctioneer's rhythm like a blade. His gavel froze mid-air. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Clara Monroe walked out from the shadows, her sapphire gown catching the light like midnight flame. The crowd parted instinctively, eyes widening, whispers surging. She moved with measured grace, every step a declaration. Sterling's face drained of color. His smirk collapsed into a twitch of disbelief. He knew her, or rather he knew the ghost she carried. Clara stopped at the edge of the stage, her gaze locked on him. Her voice calm and resonant carried to every corner of the hall. My name, she said, is Clara Monroe. I am the daughter of Jonathan Monroe. The room erupted in gasps. The name crashed through the crowd like thunder. Journalists scrambled for their pens. Patrons leaned to whisper in disbelief. Sterling's composure cracked. His voice rose strained. Security. Remove this woman immediately. 2 guards started forward, but Arthur Finch intercepted, flashing his old press badge with steel in his eyes. She has a right to be heard. Clara ignored the commotion. Her entire focus was on Sterling. My father was not a criminal. She continued, her voice sharp as glass. He was silenced, framed by the very man standing on this stage. Damian Sterling. Lies, Sterling thundered, his voice cracking. Slander from a bitter girl. Not lies, Clara cut in, her tone calm but devastating. Proof. She raised her phone. The giant screens flanking the stage flickered, then bloomed with images. The first slide, a page from her father's journal, his elegant handwriting outlining his suspicions of forgery. Gasps rippled. The second slide, the infrared photograph of the girl's sleeve, the hidden cross-hatched lines glowing in stark black and white. The forger's fingerprint undeniable. The alchemist's daughter is a forgery, Clara declared. My father knew it, and Sterling destroyed him before he could reveal it. Here is the proof he left behind. The next slide appeared Dr. Isabella Rossi's scientific analysis, her signature across the bottom. The comparison of the underdrawing with a known forger's work. Identical. Irrefutable. The hall trembled with murmurs, outraged shock. Sterling's voice rose above the noise, desperate. Fabrications, forged reports. Doctored images. Is it? Clara asked, softly tilting her head. From the side of the stage, a pale, trembling figure stepped forward. Alistair Finch, Arthur's nephew. His hands shook as he held up a tablet, but his voice rang clear enough to catch on every microphone. Mr. Sterling, he said your own financial records show a transfer of $2 million to a shell corporation 2 days before Jonathan Monroe was accused. That corporation funded the false report used to frame him. Silence thundered louder than applause. The crowd turned as one, their gazes slicing into Sterling like knives. His empire, his reputation, his gilded mask, all dissolving under the blaze of truth. No, Sterling stammered, sweat slicking his brow. This is a setup. But no one listened. The great doors of the temple swung open. 2 detectives and 2 uniformed officers entered, calm and deliberate. They walked with the inevitability of justice, their eyes locked on Sterling. Damian Sterling, the lead detective, said, his voice ringing clear, "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The room exploded into chaos. Shouts. Gasps. The flurry of cameras capturing the fall of a titan. Isabel shrank back, diamonds glittering as though mocking the collapse. Sterling's protests grew shrill, incoherent, swallowed by the click of handcuffs. Clara stood motionless, her eyes never leaving him. For years, she had seen this man as untouchable, his shadow crushing her family. Now, under the light of truth, he looked small, just another fraud stripped of costume. As they led him past, his gaze locked on hers, fury and fear twisting his face. She did not flinch. She met him with calm, storm-gray eyes. It was over. Later, as the hall emptied and Sterling's empire unraveled in whispers and phone calls, Arthur stood beside Clara. His voice was low, reverent. "You did it. You didn't just fight him, you ended him." Clara exhaled, the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. "No, the truth ended him. I just carried it." For the first time in years, she felt light. Not because the battle had been won, but because she was no longer carrying her father's disgrace alone. His name had been restored, his honor returned to the world. The next morning, headlines blazed: billionaire Damian Sterling exposed as fraud. Jonathan Monroe vindicated. After 5 years. Waitress turned whistleblower brings down Wall Street titan. But Clara did not seek the spotlight. Instead, she stood quietly at her father's side, holding his hand as tears of pride filled his eyes. She had given him back his name. Weeks later, she established the Monroe Foundation, dedicated to exposing art fraud and supporting young artists without wealth or connections. It was not vengeance, it was legacy. Because Clara had learned the most important lesson of all: wealth can build towers, but it cannot build character. Sterling had power, but no truth. Clara had nothing but truth, and it was enough to bring down an empire. The waitress was gone. What remained was Clara Monroe, daughter, warrior, heir of justice. And the city that once crushed her now whispered her name with awe.